He signed the deal without looking up, not knowing he had just handed everything back to the woman he once erased. The boardroom on the 42nd floor smelled faintly of polished oak and expensive cologne, the kind that lingered long after the men wearing it had left their mark on the world, and Daniel Brooks sat at the head of the table with the easy confidence of someone who had never truly lost, his tailored navy suit fitting like a second skin, his voice calm as he outlined projections that climbed neatly upward, every number a promise, every word a performance. And across from him the representatives of the acquiring firm listened in silence, their expressions neutral, their presence almost ghost-like behind sleek tablets and leather portfolios. The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows in sharp lines of steel and glass, Manhattan humming beneath them, unaware that in this quiet room a story years in the making was beginning to close its circle, and then the door opened, not abruptly but with a measured, deliberate ease that somehow shifted the air, a subtle change, like the moment before a storm breaks, and she walked in, heels soft against the marble floor, posture straight, movements unhurried, a woman who did not need to announce herself because the room seemed to adjust around her presence, her charcoal coat falling perfectly over a silk blouse the color of midnight, her hair pulled back with a precision that spoke of control rather than vanity, and for a brief second Daniel's voice faltered, just a fraction. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for something unfamiliar to brush against his chest, a feeling he dismissed before it could form into thought, because men like him didn't pause, didn't question, didn't look back, and yet his eyes followed her as she took her seat at the far end of the table, the distance between them filled with years neither of them spoke of, years that had reshaped one life into something sharper, colder, and entirely unrecognizable, while the other remained convinced it had always been the architect of its own success. The lead counsel cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the documents laid out in careful stacks, pages filled with clauses and signatures that would finalize the transfer of ownership, and Daniel leaned forward, pen in hand, the weight of the moment settling into something almost triumphant, because this was the deal that would cement everything, the expansion, the legacy, the proof that every risk he had taken had been worth it, and as he signed his name in clean, decisive strokes, the room remained quiet, almost reverent, as if even the city outside had paused to listen, and across from him she watched without blinking, her gaze steady, unreadable, not the gaze of someone impressed, not even the gaze of someone angry, but something far more unsettling, something composed, something finished, and when the final page was turned toward her, the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not warm, not kind, but certain, as she accepted the pen, her fingers brushing the paper with a familiarity that felt almost intimate, like someone reclaiming something long buried, and Daniel finally spoke again, his tone light, confident, looking forward to working together, he said, the practiced ease returning to his voice, and she looked up. Then, directly at him, her eyes meeting his with a calm that didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't explain, and in that single glance there was something that didn't belong in this room of polished deals and polite negotiations, something older, quieter, and far more dangerous, but he couldn't place it, not yet, not with the past locked neatly behind him where he believed it could never reach him again, and she signed her name without hesitation, the ink settling into the page as if it had always been meant to be there, and for the first time, though he didn't understand why, Daniel Brooks felt the faintest crack in the certainty he had built his life upon, because somewhere in the silence between them, a truth waited, patient and unmoving, and he had no idea that the woman sitting across from him was not just a stranger with power, but the echo of a night he had tried to forget, the woman he had once left behind when she needed him most, the woman who had disappeared without a trace, and who had just returned to take everything he thought was his. The sound of polite applause faded into the soft clink of crystal glasses as the meeting dissolved into quiet conversations, but Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly against the polished surface of the table, as if grounding himself in something solid, something familiar, while across the room she stood surrounded by her team, listening more than speaking, her presence calm, contained, almost distant, and it unsettled him in a way he could not explain, because he had built his entire life on reading people, on understanding motives before they were spoken, and yet there was nothing to read in her, no eagerness, no nervousness, not even the faintest hint of admiration, just a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, and entirely out of reach, and when their eyes met again across the room it lasted only a second, but it was enough to leave a quiet echo in his chest, something he quickly dismissed as curiosity, nothing more, because he had no reason to believe otherwise, not with everything in his life exactly where it was supposed to be, and yet as he rose to his feet and adjusted his jacket, he found himself watching her leave, her silhouette disappearing through the glass doors without a single backward glance, as if the meeting, the deal, the man himself, were all just steps in a process she had already completed long ago. And later that evening the city felt different, sharper somehow, as Daniel stood on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, the cool air brushing against his face while the lights below flickered like distant stars. His phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, confirmations, invitations to celebrate. And inside the apartment his fiancée's laughter drifted from the living room, bright and effortless, the sound of a life that was easy, polished, and entirely predictable. But he did not move toward it, not yet. Instead his mind lingered in that boardroom, replaying the moment her pen touched the paper, the quiet certainty in her expression, the way she had looked at him without recognition, or worse, without interest, and something about that unsettled him more than it should have, because he was used to being seen, to being remembered, to leaving an impression that lingered, and yet with her it felt as though he had been reduced to nothing more than a passing detail, and he exhaled slowly, shaking off the thought as he stepped back inside, the warmth of the apartment wrapping around him, the scent of vanilla candles and polished marble replacing the sterile precision of the office, and across the room his fiancée turned toward him with a bright smile, asking about the meeting, about the deal, about their future, and he answered with the confidence she expected, each word measured, each detail delivered with practiced ease, because this was the life he had chosen, the life he had built, and there was no room in it for hesitation, no space for ghosts. And yet as the night wore on and the city quieted beneath them, a faint image lingered at the edges of his mind, not clear enough to name, not strong enough to hold, but present. All the same, like a memory that refused to fully disappear, and miles away, in a space far removed from the warmth and noise of his world, she stood alone by a floor-to-ceiling window in a private office that overlooked the same city from a different angle, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, cold and precise, her reflection faint against the glass, a woman shaped by years that no one in that boardroom could see. Her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk as the signed documents lay beside her, final, irreversible, and for a moment her gaze softened, not with regret, not with anger, but with something quieter, something older, the kind of stillness that comes from surviving what was never meant to be endured. And then it was gone, replaced by the same calm control she carried into every room, because she had learned long ago that the past did not need to be revisited, only remembered. And as she turned away from the window, the city lights reflected briefly in her eyes before fading into something unreadable once more, because this was not the beginning of her story, and it was certainly not the end. It was simply the moment everything she had built in silence began to reveal itself, piece by piece, to a man who still believed he had nothing left to lose. By the next morning the city moved on as it always did, indifferent to quiet revolutions happening behind glass walls, and Daniel stepped into his office with the same controlled confidence he had carried for years, assistants greeting him, screens lighting up with schedules, numbers, opportunities, everything flowing in a rhythm he had mastered, yet something beneath that rhythm felt slightly off, like a note just out of tune. And he could not ignore it this time. Not after a restless night where sleep came in fragments and unfamiliar thoughts lingered longer than they should have, because no matter how he replayed the meeting in his mind, one detail refused to settle, the woman at the end of the table, the way she had looked at him without recognition, without reaction, as if he had never existed in her world, and that absence of connection bothered him more than any confrontation ever could, because it suggested something far more unsettling than conflict. It suggested irrelevance, and Daniel Brooks had never been irrelevant to anyone, especially not to someone with that level of control, that level of power. And as he moved through his morning routine, signing documents, taking calls, approving strategies, his attention drifted more than once to the acquisition file now sitting on his desk, her name printed neatly at the top, Evelyn Carter, a name that should have meant nothing, a name he had never encountered before, and yet it carried a strange weight he could not explain, as if it belonged to a memory just beyond reach, something familiar but deliberately forgotten, and with a subtle shift in his posture he opened the file, flipping through the pages with a precision that masked the growing curiosity beneath. Profiles, financial structures, years of strategic investments mapped out with meticulous detail, a rise that did not happen by chance, a trajectory built with intention and patience, and the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that this was not just another investor stepping into his world. This was someone who had been preparing for this moment long before he even knew it existed, someone who had studied the system, learned its weaknesses, and moved through it without drawing attention. And as he reached the final page he paused, his gaze settling on a single detail that had been easy to overlook, the earliest record of her company's formation. Dated years back, around the same time a chapter of his life had closed without hesitation, without regret. At least that was what he had always believed, but now that timeline pressed quietly against his thoughts, connecting dots he had never considered connecting before. And across the city Evelyn stood in a different office, smaller, more private, a space designed not to impress but to focus, where every decision carried weight and every silence held meaning. Her team had already dispersed, leaving behind the aftermath of a successful acquisition, yet she did not celebrate, did not indulge in the triumph that others might have claimed. Instead she moved toward a simple wooden drawer built into her desk, opening it with a slow, deliberate motion, and inside, among neatly arranged documents and personal artifacts, rested a single folded photograph, edges softened by time, untouched yet never discarded, and for a moment her hand hovered above it before she picked it up, her fingers tracing the outline without fully unfolding it, because she did not need to see what it contained. She remembered it too clearly, the version of herself captured in that image, the version that had believed in promises, in stability, in a future that had once felt certain, and her expression remained composed, unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her eyes, not pain, not even sadness, but recognition of a life that no longer existed, a life that had ended long before anyone else realized it had begun to fade. And as she placed the photograph back into the drawer and closed it gently, the sound was soft, final, like the closing of something that would not be reopened again, because whatever she had been then no longer had a place in the world she had built now. And somewhere in the distance, without knowing why, Daniel felt that same quiet shift approaching, like a truth moving steadily toward him, one he would not be able to ignore for much longer. One that would force him to look back at a past he had spent years convincing himself no longer mattered. It began with a detail so small most people would have missed it, a line buried in a financial report, a quiet adjustment in ownership percentages that did not match the projections Daniel himself had approved months ago. And as he sat alone in his office late that afternoon, the sunlight stretching long across the glass walls and turning the city beyond into a haze of gold and shadow, he stared at the numbers longer than necessary, his mind moving through them with the same precision that had built his career, except this time the pattern did not resolve into something familiar, because the more he traced the structure of the acquisition, the clearer it became that this had not been a sudden opportunity seized at the right moment. It had been constructed, layer by layer, over time, hidden behind shell investments and quiet partnerships that had never drawn attention, and at the center of it all was her, Evelyn Carter, a name that now echoed louder with every connection he uncovered, and something cold settled beneath his ribs, not fear, not yet, but recognition of a game he had not realized he was playing. And across town Evelyn moved through her evening with the same measured calm, stepping out of a black town car into the soft glow of a private event where investors and executives gathered beneath chandeliers that cast warm light over polished marble floors, conversations flowing easily, laughter rising and falling like a carefully orchestrated performance, and she blended into it without effort, her presence neither loud nor hidden, simply acknowledged, respected. And as she accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, her attention drifted briefly across the room, taking in faces she had studied long before they had ever known her name, mapping alliances, noting expressions, understanding exactly where each person stood within the shifting balance of power. And then she saw him, Daniel, standing near the bar, his posture composed but his eyes sharper than they had been the day before, scanning the room with a focus that suggested he was no longer entirely at ease. And for a moment their paths aligned, not physically but in awareness, as if both of them understood that something had changed, that the distance between past and present was narrowing in ways neither of them could fully control. And Daniel approached her with the same confidence he had worn in every room he had ever entered, but there was a question behind it now, a subtle tension in the way he held himself, as if he was searching for something just beneath the surface. And when he spoke her name it sounded measured, deliberate. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady, and she turned toward him with that same calm expression, the same unreadable gaze. "Mr. Brooks," she replied, her tone even, respectful, but without warmth, and the simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than either of them acknowledged, because there was history in the space between those words, history only one of them fully remembered. And as the conversation unfolded, polite, professional, every sentence carefully constructed. Daniel found himself watching her more closely, noticing details he had missed before, the way her eyes did not linger unnecessarily, the way her responses revealed nothing beyond what was required, the way she seemed entirely unaffected by his presence, and that was when it happened. Not a revelation, not yet, but a fracture in certainty, a moment where the past he had dismissed began to press against the present with quiet insistence. And somewhere in the back of his mind a memory stirred. Not fully formed, just a sensation, the echo of a voice, the outline of a face, something tied to a time he had chosen to leave behind without looking back, and he paused for half a second too long, just enough for her to notice, just enough for something in her expression to shift almost imperceptibly, not surprise, not recognition, but acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for that moment to arrive. And when it passed she simply inclined her head slightly, ending the conversation before it could deepen, before he could ask the question forming at the edge of his thoughts, and as she walked away, disappearing once again into the flow of the room, Daniel remained where he stood, the noise of the event fading into something distant, because for the first time since signing that deal, he was no longer certain that he understood the story he had stepped into, and somewhere within that uncertainty, a truth continued to move closer, patient and unrelenting, waiting for the moment he would finally see it for what it was. The drive back from the event was quiet, but not the comfortable kind, not the kind filled with soft music and idle thoughts. It was the kind of silence that pressed in, heavy and persistent, forcing Daniel to sit with something he had spent years avoiding, and as the city light streaked past the window of the car, reflection shifting across the glass, his mind replayed the moment she had looked at him, that pause, that almost imperceptible recognition that had flickered and disappeared before he could grasp it, and it unsettled him in a way success never could, because success followed rules, patterns, cause and effect, but this did not. This felt like something older, something unresolved, and by the time he reached his building, the question he had been resisting had already begun to take shape, not fully formed, but enough to linger at the edge of his thoughts, waiting for confirmation. And later that night, long after the apartment had quieted and the last lights of the city dimmed into a distant glow, Daniel stood alone in his study, the acquisition file open once again in front of him, pages spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to stay separate, and this time he did not skim. He did not glance, he read, slowly, deliberately, tracing every detail, every timeline, every connection, and that was when the alignment became impossible to ignore, the early foundation of her company, the first investments, the quiet accumulation of influence, all of it beginning at a point in time that intersected too closely with a part of his past he had never revisited, and his hand stilled on the page, the realization not immediate, not dramatic, but gradual, like a shadow lengthening across a room, and without thinking he reached for his phone. Scrolling through contacts he had not touched in years, names that belonged to a different version of his life, a version he had walked away from without hesitation, and for a moment he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, before he made the call, his voice steady when it connected, asking a question he had not needed to ask in a very long time, asking about someone he had not spoken of, not even to himself. And on the other end there was a pause, a brief silence that carried more weight than any answer could have, before the response came, vague, uncertain, the kind of answer that filled space without offering clarity, and when the call ended Daniel remained standing there, the phone still in his hand, the room around him feeling subtly different, as if something had shifted just beyond his control, and across the city Evelyn stood once again by the window of her office, the skyline stretched out before her in quiet indifference, her reflection steady against the glass. And for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, slow and even, the kind of breath that carried memory without letting it take hold, because she knew exactly where he was in that moment, not physically, but mentally. She knew the questions had begun, the connections forming, the past rising to meet him whether he was ready or not, and there was no satisfaction in that knowledge, no triumph, only a quiet certainty, because this had never been about watching him struggle, it had never been about forcing him to remember, it was simply the natural consequence of a truth that could no longer remain hidden, and as she turned away from the window, her expression unchanged, composed, she moved toward her desk where a single folder rested apart from the others, thinner, older, untouched by the present work surrounding it, and when she opened it the contents inside were simple, minimal, but undeniable, a series of documents that marked the moment her life had split into before and after, records that had never been erased, only set aside, and her gaze lingered on them for a brief second before she closed the folder again, because she did not need to look at them to remember what they meant. She had carried that moment with her through every decision, every step forward, every silent victory that had led her here. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Brooks finally allowed himself to consider a possibility he had refused to acknowledge, a possibility that did not yet have a name, but one that was beginning to take shape with quiet, undeniable force, and for the first time in years, certainty slipped just enough for doubt to take its place. There was a time when silence meant safety, when the absence of noise was the only thing that kept her steady, and the memory returned not as a sharp pain but as something slower, heavier, like the weight of air before a storm. And for the first time in years Evelyn allowed herself to step fully into it, not as the woman she had become, but as the one she had been before everything changed. The night the city felt colder than it ever had. The night she stood on a sidewalk under flickering streetlights with nothing but a small suitcase at her feet and one hand resting instinctively over her stomach, her breath uneven, not from fear alone but from the overwhelming realization that there was nowhere left to go, nowhere left that still belonged to her, and the memory unfolded quietly, without chaos, without raised voices, just the echo of a door closing behind her and the finality of it settling in before she could even process what had happened, because sometimes the most devastating moments do not arrive with noise, they arrive with silence, with decisions made too quickly and words spoken too calmly, words that erase a life as if it had never held value to begin with. And she remembered the way the city moved around her that night, cars passing, people walking, lights glowing in windows above, all of it continuing as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just lost everything that once defined her. And she remembered how she had stood there for what felt like minutes or hours, unable to move, unable to decide where to go next, because every option led to the same truth, that she was alone in a way she had never been before. And even then she had not cried, not in the way people expect, not with visible emotion or collapse. It had been quieter than that, something internal, something that settled deep and stayed there, shaping everything that came after. And the cold had eventually forced her to move, to pick up the suitcase, to step forward into a future she had not planned and did not understand, her body already carrying a responsibility she could not afford to ignore. And somewhere behind her the life she had known remained closed, sealed off without hesitation, without second thought. And back in the present Daniel sat at his desk long after the office had emptied, the city outside reduced to scattered lights and distant movement, his reflection faint in the darkened glass, and the memory that had begun as a vague sensation now pressed harder against his thoughts, gaining form, gaining clarity, though still incomplete. And he leaned back slowly, exhaling as if trying to create space between himself and something he was not ready to face, because the version of events he had carried for years had always been simple, clean, justified, decisions made, paths separated, nothing more. But that simplicity was beginning to fracture, and he could feel it in the way his thoughts circled back to that same point in time, that same absence of closure, that same unspoken detail he had never questioned. And it unsettled him not because of what he remembered, but because of what he did not. And across the city Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, the memory fading back into its place, not gone, never gone, but contained once again, because she had learned how to carry it without letting it define her. And when she opened her eyes the present returned with quiet clarity, the office around her, the work ahead, the path she had already chosen and followed without looking back, because whatever she had lost that night had never been returned, it had been replaced, reshaped into something stronger, something unrecognizable to the person she used to be. And as she stepped away from the window and reached for the next file waiting on her desk, there was no hesitation in her movement, no lingering attachment to what had come before, because the past had done its work, it had built her into who she was now, and the only thing left was for the truth of it to reach the one person who had never stayed long enough to understand what he had left behind. The memory did not end on that street, it followed her, quiet and persistent, into every step that came after, into the dim hallway of a 24-hour clinic where the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion. And she remembered the way she had sat there alone, her suitcase still beside her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if holding herself together required effort she could not afford to lose. The ticking clock on the wall, marking time in a way that felt detached from reality, because time did not move the same way when everything had already changed. And when her name was finally called, it echoed slightly in the empty waiting room, a sound that felt too loud for the stillness surrounding it. And she had stood slowly, steadying herself not out of weakness but out of determination, because even then, even in that moment, Something inside her refused to collapse completely, refused to give in to the version of herself that might have disappeared if she had allowed it, and the doctor had spoken gently, professionally, explaining things in careful terms that did not fully reach her, not because she could not understand them, but because her mind was already somewhere else, already moving forward, already calculating what came next, how she would rebuild, how she would survive, how she would protect the life she carried when there was no one else left to do it. And she remembered leaving that place just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten in shades of grey and pale blue, the city quieter than she had ever known it, as if even it needed a moment to breathe before beginning again, and she had walked without direction at first, just putting distance between herself and everything that had ended, until eventually movement itself became purpose, each step a decision, each block a small claim on a future she had not chosen but would not abandon. And back in the present, Daniel found himself returning to that same question over and over again, not asking it aloud, not even fully forming it in his mind, but circling it with increasing urgency, because the fragments no longer felt separate, they were beginning to align, and with that alignment came something far more difficult to ignore, the possibility that the version of events he had accepted for so long was incomplete, that there had been more to that night than he had acknowledged, more to what he had left behind than he had allowed himself to consider, and it was not regret that unsettled him, not yet, it was the realization that he had never asked the right questions, never looked closely enough to understand the full weight of what he had walked away from. And now that absence of understanding stood in front of him in the form of a woman who held more control over his present than he had ever anticipated, and across the city Evelyn moved through her day with the same steady focus that had defined her for years, meetings scheduled, decisions made, conversations conducted with clarity and precision, but beneath that surface there was a quiet awareness, a recognition that the distance between past and present was narrowing in a way that could not be undone, and she did not resist it, did not attempt to delay what was already unfolding, because she had never built her life on avoidance. She had built it on facing what was in front of her, no matter how difficult, and as she paused briefly between meetings, standing alone in a corridor lined with glass and steel, her reflection appearing faintly beside her, she allowed herself a single moment of stillness, not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge it, to recognize how far she had come from that early morning when the city had felt unfamiliar and uncertain, when every step had been taken without guarantee, and then the moment passed, as it always did, replaced by the present, by the work ahead, by the life she had created piece by piece, and somewhere within that movement forward there was a quiet certainty, not of victory, not of resolution, but of truth, a truth that no longer needed to be hidden, one that would soon stand fully in the open, whether he was ready to face it or not. Reinvention did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in quiet decisions that did not look significant at the time but carried the weight of everything that followed, and for Evelyn it began with something as simple as a name written on a form, the moment she chose not to correct the clerk who misheard her introduction, the moment she allowed the past to loosen its hold just enough to step into something undefined, something not yet shaped by expectation or memory, and from there the days turned into a rhythm that was both relentless and necessary, long hours spent learning what she had once trusted others to handle, numbers, contracts, systems that governed a world she had only observed from the outside, and she did not approach it with urgency, not with desperation, but with a quiet determination that did not waver even when progress felt invisible, because she understood something most people never did, that survival was not built on moments of strength, it was built on consistency, on the ability to continue when no one was watching, when there was no recognition, no validation, only the steady movement forward, and over time that movement began to take shape, opportunities appearing where there had once been none, connections forming not through charm or persuasion but through reliability, through the simple fact that she did what she said she would do, every time, without exception. And it was that consistency that drew attention, not loudly, not all at once, but gradually, until her presence in certain rooms no longer felt accidental, until her voice carried weight even when she spoke less than others, and back in the present Daniel sat across from his legal team, their voices low, precise, outlining the implications of the acquisition, the shifts in control, the adjustments that would need to be made moving forward, but his focus drifted again, not to the numbers this time, but to the gaps between them, the places where intention had been hidden, where decisions had been made long before they reached his awareness, and he found himself asking questions he would not have considered before, questions about the origins of the firm, about its earliest backers, about the individuals who had quietly aligned themselves with her long before her name carried influence, and each answer brought clarity, but also unease, because the pattern that emerged was not random, it was deliberate, precise, and deeply personal in a way he could not yet define. And across the city Evelyn stepped into another meeting, her presence greeted with respect that had been earned over years of work no one in that room had witnessed, and as she took her seat at the head of the table, she did not think about the path that had brought her there. She did not revisit the nights that had shaped her or the mornings that had tested her resolve, because those moments had already done their work, they had already become part of the foundation she stood on now, and the only thing that mattered was what came next, the decisions ahead, the direction she would set. And as the discussion began, her voice steady, her gaze clear, there was no hesitation in the way she moved through the conversation, no trace of the uncertainty that had once defined her early steps, because she had learned to exist in this space without needing approval, without needing acknowledgement, and somewhere beneath that calm exterior there was a quiet understanding that the distance between who she had been and who she was now could never be bridged, not by memory, not by explanation, only by acceptance. And as the meeting concluded and the room began to clear, she remained seated for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the table, her thoughts not drifting backward but forward, always forward, because whatever questions were beginning to form on his side of the story, whatever realizations were slowly taking shape, they would arrive on their own, in their own time, and she would not rush them, would not interfere, because the truth did not need to be forced, it only needed to be revealed, and when it did, it would not change what had already been built, it would only make it impossible to ignore. Power rarely announces itself with noise, it reveals itself in quiet shifts that most people do not notice until it is too late to change them, and Daniel began to see those shifts everywhere now, not in dramatic losses or sudden collapse, but in small adjustments that accumulated into something undeniable, meetings where his opinion was no longer the final word, decisions that required approval he had never needed before, conversations that paused just a second longer when he entered the room, as if recalibrating around a presence that no longer held the same certainty, and none of it was overt, none of it could be pointed to as a single moment of change, but together it formed a pattern he could not ignore, a pattern that led back to her, always back to her, and he found himself watching more closely, listening more carefully, trying to understand not just what she was doing, but how she was doing it, because there was no aggression in her approach, no visible attempt to dominate or control, only a steady redirection of momentum that placed her exactly where she needed to be without drawing attention to the movement itself, and it unsettled him more than any direct confrontation ever could, because it meant he had underestimated something fundamental, not just about her, but about the situation he had stepped into. And across the table in another meeting Evelyn listened as executives presented updates, their voices measured, their data precise, but her attention was not on the surface details, it was on the underlying structure, the way systems connected, the way influence moved through people and processes, and when she spoke it was brief, specific, a single observation that shifted the direction of the discussion without needing to assert authority, because authority was already there, unspoken but recognized, and as the room adjusted to her input she remained composed, her expression unchanged, her focus steady, because this was not new to her, this was the result of years spent understanding how power actually worked, not as a performance, but as a system that responded to clarity and consistency. And later that evening Daniel stood alone in his office once again, the city stretching out below him in quiet indifference, his reflection faint in the glass as he reviewed a series of internal reports that confirmed what he had begun to suspect, ownership structures shifting, decision-making channels narrowing, influence consolidating in ways that aligned perfectly with her position. And for the first time the realization was no longer abstract, it was concrete, undeniable. She was not just part of the company now, she was the company, and he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting against the desk as the weight of that truth settled in, not as panic, not as defeat, but as something more complex, something that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he understood about control, about permanence, about the choices he had made and the assumptions he had carried forward without question. And in that moment a memory surfaced again, clearer this time, not just a sensation but an image, a night, a decision made without hesitation, a door closing, a future dismissed as unnecessary, and the connection formed slowly but with increasing certainty, not yet complete, but no longer avoidable. And across the city Evelyn prepared to leave for the evening, gathering her things with the same quiet efficiency that defined everything she did, her office dimming around her as the last lights of the day faded into the glow of the skyline. And for a brief moment she paused, her gaze resting on the city below, not with nostalgia, not with reflection, but with recognition of the distance she had traveled, not measured in miles or time, but in transformation, in the quiet, relentless process of becoming someone who no longer needed to be seen to exist. And as she turned to leave, the door closing softly behind her, there was a sense of movement not just in her own story, but in his as well, a convergence that had been years in the making, now approaching a point where it could no longer remain unspoken, because truth, once it begins to surface, does not retreat. It continues forward, steady and unyielding, until it is finally acknowledged. The confrontation did not happen with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It unfolded in a conference room lined with glass and quiet authority, where the city stretched endlessly beyond them and every sound seemed to carry further than it should, and Daniel stood at the far end of the table, a folder in his hand, his posture controlled but no longer effortless, because the question that had been forming for days had finally reached a point where it could not remain unspoken, and across from him Evelyn sat with the same calm composure she had carried into every room, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression unreadable, as if she had already anticipated this moment long before it arrived, and for a brief second neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them not as hesitation but as recognition, and when Daniel finally broke it his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something that had not been there before. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, the word simple, direct, but carrying the weight of everything he had begun to understand, and she did not respond immediately, not because she needed time, but because she chose her moments with precision, and when she spoke her tone was even, almost quiet. "Long enough," she said, and the answer should have frustrated him, should have pushed him toward insistence, but instead it confirmed what he already knew, that this had never been a coincidence, never been an opportunity that appeared by chance. It had been built, deliberately, patiently, and he took a step closer, placing the folder on the table between them, documents inside marked with timelines, connections, evidence of a pattern that no longer felt abstract. "You positioned yourself in every part of the company before I even saw it," he said, not accusing, not yet, but searching, trying to understand the full scope of what he had missed, and her gaze met his without resistance, without apology. "I built something of my own," she replied, and there was no emphasis in her words, no need to defend or explain, because the truth of it stood on its own, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow around them, the distance between past and present collapsing into something that could no longer be ignored. And Daniel studied her more closely now, not as an executive, not as a competitor, but as someone trying to place a memory that refused to fully reveal itself, and that was when it happened, not a sudden realization, not a dramatic shift, but a quiet alignment, the voice, the stillness, the way she held herself with a kind of control that felt familiar in a way he could no longer dismiss. And his expression changed, just slightly, enough for her to see it, enough for the final piece to begin settling into place, and he exhaled slowly, the weight of that recognition pressing against him with a clarity that was both undeniable and deeply unsettling. "Evelyn," he said, this time not as a formal address, but as a name he was trying to connect to something more, something beyond the present moment, and she did not look away, did not interrupt, did not offer the answer he was searching for, because she did not need to. The truth was already there, already moving toward him without her assistance, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years, everything that had been carried forward without acknowledgement, and for the first time Daniel understood that this was not just about a company, not just about control or power, it was about something far more personal, something that had begun long before this room, long before this deal, something he had walked away from without ever turning back, and now it stood in front of him, composed, unshaken, impossible to ignore, and as he remained there, the realization continuing to settle, Evelyn simply watched, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed anything from the past, because whatever answers he was beginning to find, they would not change what had already been done, they would only reveal it for what it truly was. The silence between them did not break, it deepened, stretching into something that no longer belonged to the present moment alone but carried the full weight of everything that had come before it, and Daniel felt it in the way his breath slowed, in the way the room seemed to close in without physically changing, because the realization he had been circling finally settled with a clarity he could not push aside, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "It was you," he said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as something closer to acceptance, and Evelyn did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but there was no denial in her silence, no attempt to redirect or soften the truth that had already surfaced, and for a moment Daniel looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the composed executive across the table, but as the person he had once known, the person he had chosen to leave behind without looking back, and the distance between those two versions of her felt impossible to reconcile, and he exhaled slowly, the memory now fully formed, no longer fragmented, no longer distant, it was there in its entirety, the night, the decision, the certainty he had carried then, believing he was moving forward, believing he was making the right choice, and the weight of that belief shifted now, not into regret, not fully, but into something more complicated, something that forced him to confront the simplicity with which he had dismissed a life that had clearly not ended the way he had assumed. "And you disappeared," he said, the words coming out before he could reconsider them, and this time Evelyn's response came without delay, her voice calm. "No," she said softly, "I did not disappear," and there was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, only clarity. "You stopped looking," and the simplicity of that statement carried more force than anything else she could have said, because it reframed everything, shifted the narrative he had accepted into something far less certain, far less controlled, and he stood there, absorbing it, understanding that the absence he had attributed to her had never been about her leaving. It had been about his own decision not to turn back. Not to question, not to stay long enough to see what followed, and the realization did not break him, it did not unravel him in any visible way, but it altered something fundamental, something internal that no longer aligned with the version of himself he had relied on for years, and across from him Evelyn remained still, not pressing the moment, not expanding on it, because she did not need to. The truth had already been placed between them, clear and complete, and there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to explain, and after a moment Daniel nodded slightly, more to himself than to her, acknowledging something he could no longer deny, and the conversation shifted, not back to business, not forward into resolution, but into a quiet understanding that the past had finally caught up to the present in a way neither of them could ignore, and as he gathered the folder from the table, his movement slower now, more deliberate, there was no attempt to regain control of the situation, no effort to assert the authority he once held, because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that this was no longer a situation he controlled, and Evelyn watched him without judgment, without expectation, because whatever realization he was coming to belonged to him alone, just as everything she had built belonged to her. And when he turned to leave, pausing briefly at the door, there was a moment where it seemed he might say something more, might reach for a question or a statement that could bridge the distance between who they had been and who they were now, but he did not, because some distances are not meant to be bridged, they are meant to be recognized and accepted, and as the door closed behind him, the room returned to its quiet stillness, leaving Evelyn alone once more, exactly as she had been at the beginning of this journey, but no longer the same person who had once stood alone without direction, because this time the silence did not represent loss, it represented completion. The aftermath did not come with chaos, it arrived in quiet adjustments that settled into place with a precision that left no room for resistance, and over the following days Daniel moved through the company with a heightened awareness of every shift, every decision that now passed through channels he no longer controlled, every meeting where his voice carried weight but not authority, and there was no public announcement that marked the change, no dramatic declaration that redefined his role. Only the steady, undeniable reality that the structure he had built was no longer his to direct, and it was in that subtle transition that the full extent of what had happened became clear, not as a loss taken from him, but as something that had been reclaimed by someone who had earned it in ways he had never taken the time to understand, and across the organization Evelyn continued her work without deviation, her approach unchanged, her presence consistent, because this moment was not an end point for her, it was simply a continuation of everything she had already been doing, every decision still guided by the same clarity, the same discipline that had brought her here, and when she entered rooms now there was no question about her position, no uncertainty about her role, it was recognized without needing to be stated, and she did not linger on it, did not allow it to define her, because power, to her, was never about recognition, it was about responsibility, about ensuring that what she had built remained stable, intentional, and aligned with the standards she had set for herself long before anyone else had been paying attention, and one afternoon Daniel found himself standing in the same boardroom where everything had begun, the glass walls reflecting a city that had not changed, even as everything within the room had, and for a moment he remained still, his gaze resting on the table where he had once signed with complete certainty, where he had believed he was securing his future, and now that moment felt different, not like a mistake, not exactly, but like a decision made without full understanding, a decision that had carried consequences he had never anticipated, and as he stood there he did not feel anger, not toward her, not toward the situation, because the clarity of it left little room for misplaced emotion. Instead there was something quieter, something closer to recognition, an acknowledgement that what had happened was not random, not unfair, it was the result of paths taken and paths abandoned, of choices made without looking back and the realities those choices eventually created, and later that same day he saw her again, not in a formal meeting, not across a table of negotiations, but in the hallway outside the executive offices, where the space felt less structured, less guarded, and for a moment their paths crossed without the presence of others, without the framework of business to contain the interaction, and he paused, just slightly, enough to signal that this moment was different, that it did not belong to the same category as their previous conversations, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the sharpness it once might have held. "You built all of this," he said, not as a challenge, not even as a question, but as a statement he had finally accepted, and Evelyn met his gaze with the same steady composure. "Yes," she replied simply, and there was nothing more in her tone, no elaboration, no attempt to draw attention to the significance of what that meant, because for her it did not need to be emphasized, it simply was, and Daniel nodded once, a small movement that carried more weight than any extended conversation could have, because it marked a shift, not in power, that had already been established, but in understanding, in the way he now saw the situation, the way he now saw her, and as they stood there for a brief moment longer, there was no attempt to revisit the past, no effort to rewrite it or soften its edges, because both of them understood that some things remain exactly as they are, unchanged by time or realization, and as Evelyn continued down the hallway, her steps steady, her focus already returning to what came next, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, the quiet of the space settling around him, not as something oppressive, but as something final, something that no longer required resolution because it had already reached its natural conclusion. The city looked the same as it always had, a grid of light and motion stretching endlessly into the distance, indifferent to the quiet transformations that had taken place within it, and from the top floor Evelyn stood by the window once more, her reflection faint against the glass, not as a reminder of who she had been, but as a recognition of who she had become, and there was no triumph in her expression, no visible sense of victory, only a calm steadiness that came from knowing there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim, because everything she had once lost had been replaced not by what it was, but by something stronger, something entirely her own, and behind her the office remained quiet, organized, every detail in place, a reflection of the discipline that had carried her forward when there had been no guarantee of where that path would lead, and she did not linger in the moment, did not allow herself to dwell on the significance of it, because she understood something that few people ever truly did, that closure is not found in confrontation or acknowledgement, it is found in the absence of need, in the moment when the past no longer holds influence over the present, and as she turned away from the window, her steps unhurried, her focus already shifting toward what came next, there was a quiet finality in the movement, not as an ending, but as a continuation that no longer required looking back, and across the building Daniel stood in his office, the door closed, the noise of the company muted beyond the walls, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to remain still without distraction, without the constant forward motion that had once defined him, and the realization that had settled over the past days no longer felt unfamiliar, it felt integrated, part of a larger understanding that had reshaped the way he saw not only her, but himself, and he moved toward the window, the same view, the same city, yet somehow different in the way it reflected back at him, because the certainty he had once relied on had shifted into something quieter, something more aware, and he did not reach for what had been lost, did not attempt to reclaim control or rewrite the past, because he understood now that some outcomes are not meant to be reversed, they are meant to be accepted, and in that acceptance there was a kind of clarity he had not known before, not comfortable, not easy, but honest, and later, as the building began to empty and the evening settled in, their paths crossed one final time near the exit, not planned, not arranged, just a simple alignment of movement, and they paused, not out of obligation, not out of unresolved tension, but because the moment called for acknowledgement, and for a brief second they stood facing each other, no longer defined by what had happened between them, but by what they had each become because of it, and Daniel inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried respect rather than regret, and Evelyn returned it with the same quiet composure, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left that required words, and as she stepped past him and continued forward, the doors opening with a soft sound before closing again behind her, there was no hesitation in her movement, no glance backward, only the steady continuation of a life she had built without needing permission, without needing recognition, and Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the space she had just moved through, not with longing, not with loss, but with a clear understanding of something he had not known before. That the most powerful form of closure does not come from what is taken or given, but from what is no longer needed, and as he finally turned away, the building lights dimming around him, the story that had once defined them both settled into its final shape, not as a victory or a defeat, but as a quiet, undeniable truth. She had not returned to take anything from him, she had returned as someone who no longer needed anything at all.